Hi, my name is Christopher Malcolm. Welcome to Movable Canvas, where we talk about cinema, art, culture, and where those three things sometimes intersect. In today's episode, we'll go for a stay at the Overlook Hotel. It's Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film, The Shining, based on a book by Stephen King. Wednesday night, I went and rewatched what many consider one of the scariest horror movies of all time. Actually, if I'm being strictly honest, it was Wednesday morning. A, I'm a morning person, and B, I'm not the biggest horror movie person in the world. It's not that I have any fundamental issues with the genre. It's just that I never completely wrapped my head around why people actually want to be scared. In fact, they pay tons of money to be scared if you go by the box office. I actually love to talk to a social scientist one of these days to figure out what it is about human beings that make us actually enjoy that sensation. But I digress. But there is one thing that I already know. A great movie is a great movie, which is why when I saw that The Shining was being re-released in IMAX at the local movie theater, I was quick to grab a ticket. I will say one thing. Watching a scary movie in the comfort of strangers is far better than the way I usually watch The Shining, which is buried under the blanket at home with one eye barely peeking out from underneath the covers. But as with any great film, watching it on the big screen and early in the morning while I was still awake, it gave me a new perspective, not only on the scares, but on the elegant filmmaking on display from one of cinema's most iconic directors. Before becoming a director, Stanley Kubrick was a still photographer. And since I make part of my living shooting commercial photography campaigns, I've always taken that particular aspect of him to note. When it comes to film directors, they generally come in two varieties. There are directors who began life as writers or actors who, not always, but quite often put their skills to use on story or performance and leave much of the film's photography to the film cinematographer. Then there's the other set of directors who came up through the camera department, the pure director DP route. They tend to basically let the actors have free reign while they spend most of their time on set micromanaging every camera, lens, and light in sight. Obviously, the best directors are a mix of both of these skill sets. But when you have a background as someone who has made their living being very hands-on with the camera and lighting, the way a still photographer would be, I will confess that it can be hard to let anyone else determine the visual look of your film. All I've read about Stanley Kubrick suggests that he suffers from the same affliction that I do. While not always the official cinematographer on his projects, John Alcott was the DP on this particular one, Kubrick would also operate his own camera, particularly on handheld shots. And he was always very involved with the practical decisions associated with lensing and lighting his projects. Speaking of operating camera, The Shining was also one of the early films to deploy what has become a fundamental part of cinema's visual language, the Steadicam. Created by Garrett Brown and debuting as the Brown Stabilizer on Bound for Glory, followed by films like Rocky, The Marathon Man, the Steadicam, as it became known, is a device that allows the operator to stabilize footage when taking moving shots through it's like a counterbalance rig that the operator wears mounted to their body. It allows for smooth shots in places where laying track or pushing a dolly would be impractical. Yet you still want a smoother motion than you'd be able to get handheld, so you break out the Steadicam. Probably the most famous Steadicam shots in The Shining are those kind of low-angle shots where we're following Danny on his tricycle as he wheels through the halls of the Overlook Hotel, which, by the way, the exteriors were actually filmed at the Timberline Hotel in Oregon, while the interiors were filmed at Elstree Studios in England. Now, when I tell you that even the sight of a young child riding a tricycle has the power to fill me with a sense of dread, well, you may be tempted to blame that on the very real truth that I am a complete scaredy cat. But I'm hardly alone getting a shiver in my spine while watching that scene. So it begs the question, what is it that Kubrick was doing that makes every frame of that film filled with so much suspense? The basic logline of the film is simple. It's a story about a writer, played by Jack Nicholson, in one of his most iconic roles, who takes a job as something of a caretaker at a mountain lodge during the off-season. He brings along his family for an extended stay. His wife, played by Shelley Duvall, is perhaps her best-known performance, and their young son, Danny, played by actor Danny Lloyd. On paper, it sounds like a dream, an extended stay at a quiet retreat where Nicholson can work on his novel and the family can relax. But even in an oversized hotel like the Overbrook, a bit of cabin fever begins to creep in. Combined with some paranormal occurrences that begin to happen to the wife and child, there's a growing sense of anticipation that something bad may happen. The film itself begins in the very first scene with Nicholson's job interview. His potential employer feels compelled to warn him that the previous caretaker went a little crazy. And by a little crazy, I mean that previous caretaker went so crazy that he murdered his wife and children with an axe. In need of a job and not seeming like the kind of guy who would even care either way, Nicholson takes the position anyway. And off to the Overlook Hotel they go. I mentioned that early scene because I think it's key to understanding why all the scenes that follow carry with them such a sense of dread. The scene itself isn't that suspenseful. It's just three men sitting in a room discussing employment. But by introducing the haunted past of the mansion itself right up front, it flavors all the scenes to follow, and it sets us up to wait for the other shoe, or in this case, axe, to drop. But rewatching The Shining this time around in IMAX, there's actually another scene that stood out to me, and another scene that reframed much of what the film's power is based on. As I mentioned earlier, many regard The Shining as one of the best horror movies of all time. But I'm also 100% sure that when I say that, there are true horror fans in the audience that are screaming back at their TV that The Shining isn't a horror movie. They might suggest that it's more of a psychological thriller. Well, I'm not going to wade into the middle of that fight. But I do want to suggest a third option, or maybe a subcategory, depending on how you rank the first two. And it all centers around another early scene, an often overlooked scene. Even at the beginning of the film, the couple's young child, Danny, is clearly going through something. He's quiet and detached. He's grown fond of an imaginary friend he calls Tony. Now, there are a million theories on whether Tony is actually an imaginary friend or something deeper. Is Tony a manifestation of Danny's psychic abilities? A fictional character that Danny's just made up in his head to get through the loneliness of being a child? Or even some kind of telepathic version of Danny from the future coming back to give him advice? Whatever the answer, Danny is not your typical kid. Early in the film, prior to the family's leaving for the hotel, Danny has something of a psychotic break. Concerned, Shelley Duvall's character calls in a child psychologist to help and ensure that everything is okay. Seeking to get to the bottom of things, the shrink asks when Danny started having his imaginary friend come to visit. That's when it's revealed that Tony's appearance roughly coincided with an incident that occurred between Danny and his father that resulted in Danny having a dislocated shoulder months earlier. While Shelley Duvall tries to downplay the implications, it's clear that while lost in a drunken stupor, Nicholson's character has beaten his child. She says, it's just that sort of thing that you do 100 times to a child, referring to the incident as an accident. But the look on the psychiatrist's face tells us all we need to know. This is the type of story she's heard 1,000 times before. And the fact that Duvall's story ends with an optimistic suggestion that the incident convinced her husband to stop drinking only fills us with more dread. I think we've all heard that story, or variations of it, a million times. It was only an accident. I'm going to stop drinking, I swear. So while that scene isn't nearly as well remembered as the more dynamic scenes in the film, I do believe it's that single conversation that is really the key driver for the entire film. Even later when the in-season caretaker, Scatman Carruthers, is giving the family a tour of the facility and mentions that the hotel's booze is removed for the off-season, it again reminds us of the sleeping beast hidden inside Jack Nicholson's character. Seen through that lens, The Shining actually becomes a third type of story for me. Perhaps a horror film, perhaps a psychological thriller, but also a powerful tragedy of domestic abuse. Later in the film, when we see the famous all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy scene, and Shelley Duvall's character begins to truly freak the heck out, coming to grips with the scale of her husband's depravity, Jack Nicholson's character walks kind of slowly towards her as she's backing up the set of stairs. She's terrified. At this point, he hasn't gone all here's Johnny. He's just sort of stalking towards her with this kind of twisted charm. When viewed through the lens of the early discussion, though, this becomes more than just a rote depiction of a scene we've seen a million times when the killer is threatening a victim. Instead, given their history, we understand that the fear in her eyes is a long time coming. True that in this moment, they're at the height of their craziness at the Overbrook Hotel, but it doesn't stretch the imagination to think that she's faced this very moment back home a million times when Jack came home drunk and ready to fight. I was actually talking to a woman who identified that as the most emotional scene in the film for her. And while I just kind of overlooked it as, entertainment earlier, the sheer look on Shelley Duvall's face this time around really rung true and had different layers of meaning. Both she and Danny were victims long before they ever arrived at the Overbrook. The unbearable remoteness of the lodge only amplified the potential for violence that was already there. If you get a chance, I highly suggest going to see The Shining, or any film for that matter, on the big screen. From the very first frame, that kind of crane shot of the car driving down the winding road, Kubrick's deft talent for composition is on full display. In shots like the famous Danny on a tricycle scene, you realize that he's building tension not through jump scares or mindless quick editing. Instead, he's building tension through longer, more drawn-out takes, further enhanced by immaculate sound design. A shot like Danny on the tricycle is scary because we never know what's going to be right around that corner. A scene like them running through the grass maze just outside is equally infused with tension. For one, mazes freak me out. What if you get trapped? But the writer is also giving us a foundation for what is to come. And by establishing the primal threat of the film before we even reach the hotel, the filmmakers have created a story where Every frame that follows is filled with tension, threat, and true horror. Thanks for watching another episode of Movable Canvas. If you like this type of material, be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. I try to post a new essay like once a month, diving into some of the greatest films that Hollywood and the rest of the world have to offer. And what do you think? Is The Shining a horror movie or a psychological thriller? Was Tony just Danny's imaginary friend, or did he really have the ability to shine as described by Scatman Crothers? And for the Stephen King fans out there, what do you think of Kubrick's adaptation? I'd love to hear from you in the comments, but until then, thanks for watching and have a great day.